This video depicts topics of violence, murder, and death and is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Guatemalan genocide against the Ixil Maya is a tragic chapter in Guatemala's history that occurred during the country's 36-year-long civil war, which lasted from 1960 to 1996. The conflict primarily pitted the Guatemalan government, supported by the powerful elites and military forces, against various leftist guerrilla groups representing disenfranchised indigenous populations and rural peasants. The genocide against the Ixil Maya, a Mayan indigenous group inhabiting the mountainous regions of the Quiché department of Guatemala, took place during the early 1980s under the presidency of General Efrain Rios Montt. Rios Montt came to power in a military coup in 1982, overthrowing his predecessor, General Romeo Lucas Garcia's. Rios Montt regimes implemented a scorched earth campaign targeted indigenous communities suspected of supporting leftist insurgents, particularly the guerrilla group known as the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, EGP. The Ixal Maya were especially targeted due to their perceived support of the EGP and their resistance to government policies that forced wealthy landowners and corporations at the expense of indigenous rights and land tenure. The Guatemalan military, under orders from Rios Montes' government, carried out widespread human rights violations, including massacres, forced disappearances, torture, and actual violence against the Ixil population. Key aspects of the Guatemalan genocide against the Ixil Maya include the following: scorched earth tactics. The Guatemalan military implemented a brutal scorched earth campaign in the Ixil region, aiming to destroy not only the guerrilla forces but also the civilian population suspected of sympathizing with them. Entire villages were targeted for destruction, with homes burnt, crops destroyed, and livestock killed. Massacres and atrocities. Numerous massacres occurred during this period, with the military indiscriminately killing men, women, and children. These massacres often involved gruesome violence, including machete attacks, shootings, and rape. Forced displacement and concentration camps. The Ixil Maya were forcibly displaced from their ancestral lands and relocated to government established model villages or concentration camps. These camps were often overcrowded and lacked basic necessities, leading to widespread suffering and death from hunger, disease, and exposure. Systematic raping and actual violence. Women and girls were particularly targeted for actual violence by the military forces. Rape was used as a weapon of war to terrorize and demoralize the civilian population. Denial and impunity. Despite overwhelming evidence of the atrocities committed against the Ixil Maya, successive Guatemalan governments have denied the genocide and resisted efforts to hold perpetrators accountable. Many military officials responsible for human rights abuses during the Civil War have enjoyed immunity, shielded by the laws and amnesty provisions. Legal proceedings and justice. Efforts to seek justice for the victims of the Guatemalan genocide have forced numerous challenges. Both domestically and internationally. In 2013, General Efran Rios Monte was found guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity in a landmark trial, though the verdict was later overturned on procedural grounds. Despite setbacks, advocacy groups and survivors continue to pursue legal avenues for accountability and reparations. The Guatemalan genocide against the Ixil Maya remains deeply traumatic and unresolved issue, highlighting the ongoing struggle for justice, reconciliation, and indigenous rights in Guatemala. The Guatemalan Civil War from 1960 to 1996 had a profound impact on the genocide of the Ixil Maya. The Civil War provided the backdrop and context for the genocide, with the conflict exacerbating the existing tensions and grievances between the Guatemalan government and the indigenous populations, including the Ixal Maya. The Civil War intensified this state of repression and violence against the perceived opponents of the government, including indigenous communities like the Ixal Maya. As the conflict escalated, the military increasingly targeted indigenous communities and populations suspected of supporting leftist guerrilla groups. This led to significant increase in human rights violations, including massacres, forced disappearances, and torture. The Guatemalan government, particularly under the regimes like that of General Efran Rios Montt, implemented brutal counterinsurgencies strategies aimed at eradicating support for the guerrilla groups among indigenous communities. The Scorched Earth campaign against the Ixil Maya was part of its broader effort to support dissent and eliminate perceived threats to the state. Throughout the Civil War, indigenous populations, including the Ixal Maya, were disproportionately, targeted for violence and repression by the Guatemalan military and security forces. Discriminatory policies and practices perpetuated by the government exacerbated social and economic inequalities, marginalizing indigenous communities and fueling resentment and resistance. The Civil War also led to widespread forced displacement of indigenous communities, including the Ixal Maya, from their ancestral lands. Military operations and violence disrupted traditional livelihoods, destroyed crops and infrastructure, and forced many indigenous peoples to flee their homes and seek refuge in remote areas or neighboring countries. The prolonged conflict and violence inflicted severe psychological trauma on the Ixel Maya and other indigenous communities, resulting in lasting scars and disruption into social fabric. Massacres, disappearance, and actual violence perpetrated by the military had devastating effects on individuals and families, contributing to a climate of fear and distrust. Despite the end of the Civil War and the significant peace accords in 1996, the legacy of impunity of human rights abuses committed during the conflict continues to impact indigenous communities, including the Ixal Maya. Perpetrators of the genocide and other atrocities have largely escaped accountability, further deepening wounds and hindering efforts at reconciliation and healing. Overall, the Guatemalan Civil War created conditions conducive to the genocide of the Ixal Maya, exacerbating historical injustices and systematic discrimination while providing the rationale and opportunity for state sponsored violence and repression against indigenous populations. Several key figures were involved in orchestrating and carrying out the Guatemalan genocide against the Ixil Maya during the early 1980s. Here's just a brief description of some of the prominent figures. General Efran Rios Montt. Rios Montt was a key figure in the Guatemalan genocide as he served as the de facto president of Guatemala from March 1982 to August 1983, during the height of the genocide against the Ixil Maya. He came to power through a military coup and implemented a scorched earth campaign targeting indigenous communities suspected of supporting leftist guerrilla groups. Reyes-Montt was later convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, though the verdict was subsequently overturned. General Fernando Romeo Lucas Garcia. Lucas Garcia preceded Reyes-Montt as the president of Guatemala and was in power from 1978 to 1982. Although he was not directly responsible for the genocide against the Ixil Maya, his administration laid the groundwork for the military's brutal tactics and repression against the indigenous populations of the country. Military commanders and officers. Various military commanders and officers were directly involved in planning and executing the genocide against the Ixil Maya. These include regional military commanders, intelligence officers, and troops who carried out massacres, forced displacements, and other human rights violations. Civilian government officials. Beyond the military leadership, civilian government officials include members of Rio Mont's cabinet and other political elites played a key role in endorsing and supporting the policies and actions that led to the genocide against the Ixil Maya. They provided political cover and justification for the military's campaign of repression. Paramilitary groups. Paramilitary groups, often allied with the military and land owning elites, also played a significant role in carrying out violence against the Ixil Maya and other indigenous communities. These groups operated with impunity and collaborated with the military in targeting suspected guerrilla sympathizers and communities. Thankfully, the survivors and witnesses were the voices of the genocide, including many Ixil Maya individuals and human rights activists. They've been instrumental in documenting the atrocities and seeking justice for the victims. Their testimonies have shed light on the horrors of the genocide and contributed to the efforts for accountability and reconciliations. These were some of the key figures, among others, who were instrumental in perpetrating the genocide against the Ixil Maya, which resulted in widespread suffering, death, and displacement within the indigenous community. The Guatemalan genocide against the Ixil Maya officially ended with the ousting of the General Efran Rios Monte from power in 1983. Rios Monte's regime, characterized by its brutal counter-insurgency tactics and widespread human rights abuses, including the genocide against the Ixil Maya, faced growing domestic and international pressure. Here are just a few of the contributing factors that ended the genocide. International pressure. Increase in international condemnation of human rights violations committed by the Guatemalan government, including the genocide against the Ixil Maya, played a significant role in pressuring Rios Montes' regime to end its campaign of repression. International human rights organization, foreign rights governments, and the United Nations drew attention to the atrocities and called for an end to the violence. Despite the regime's effort to suppress dissidents, internal opposition to Rios Monte's authoritarian rule continued to grow. Civil society groups, including indigenous organizations and human rights activists, mobilized against the government's policies and advocated for justice and accountability for its victims of genocide. Rios Montes' presidency came to an end on August 1983 when he was overthrown in a military coup led by General Oscar Humberto Mejia Victores. The coup was partially motivated by discontent within the military ranks over Rios Montt's authoritarian rule and deteriorating security situation in the country. Following Rios Montes' ousting, Guatemala began a transition to civilian rule, with General Mejia Victores assuming power as the new de facto president. While the transition did not immediately lead to an end to violence or impunity for past human rights abuses, it marked a turning point in Guatemala's political landscape. Despite the official end of the genocide against the Ixil Maya in 1983, violence and human rights violations persisted in Guatemala for years to come as the country continued to grapple with the legacy of the Civil War and the genocide. Efforts to achieve justice, accountability, and reconciliation for the victims of the genocide have been ongoing, both domestically and internationally, highlighting the long term impact of the atrocities committed against the Ixal Maya and other indigenous communities. Genocide is defined by the United Nations in 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. This includes killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Preventing genocide requires a multifaceted approach that addresses underlying causes and risk factors, promotes early warning and intervention, and strengthens mechanisms for accountability and justice. Here's some of the key strategies for preventing genocide: promoting human rights and the rule of law. Upholding human rights and strengthening the rule of law are fundamental for preventing genocide. This includes protecting the rights of marginalized groups and vulnerable groups, promoting equality and non discrimination, and ensuring accountability for perpetrators of human rights abuses. Conflict prevention and resolution, addressing the root causes of conflicts such as poverty, inequality, ethnic tension, and political grievances can help prevent situations from escalating into genocide. Diplomacy, mediation, and dialogue are essential tools for resolving conflicts peacefully and addressing grievances before they escalate into violence. Early warning and responses, developing early warning systems and mechanisms for monitoring and responding to signs of potential genocide or mass atrocities is crucial. This involves collected and analyzed information about human rights abuses, hate speech, and incitement to violence, and taken timely action to prevent further escalation. Building inclusive societies, fostering social cohesion, tolerance, and inclusivity is essential for preventing genocide. This includes promoting dialogues and reconciliation among different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups, addressing historical injustices, and empowering marginalized communities to participate in decision making processes. Educating and raising awareness. Educating and about public awareness raising campaigns can help challenges stereotypes, combat hate speech, and promote understanding and empathy among diverse communities. Teaching about the history of genocide and its consequences can help foster a culture of remembrance and prevention. International cooperation and accountability. Strengthening international cooperation and coordination is essential for preventing genocide. This includes supporting the network of international organizations such as the United Nations and regional bodies in monitoring and responding to situations of concern, as well as holding perpetrators of genocide and mass atrocities accountable through mechanisms such as the International Criminal Court (ICC) or ad hoc tribunals. By implementing these strategies and prioritizing the prevention of genocide as a global imperative, the international community can work towards creating a world where such atrocities are no longer tolerated or allowed to occur.